we are back on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. It may seem incongruous as the world seems to teeter on the brink of war to talk about squirrels, but there is more to the story of squirrels and economics and competition, all of which ties together with current events. And our next guest is going to help us unravel all of that. Our good friend Lynn Parramore is a cultural historian and author, and a recent article of hers published in the Institute for New Economic Thinking is entitled Fable of the Squirrels, New Research on Wealth Inequality Among Animals Sparks Debate on Human Economies. So first of all, Lynn, welcome back to the program.
Always great to be with you, Richard. Thanks for having me.
Oh, always a pleasure. And, you know, it seems as if for centuries at least, human beings have looked to animals and their behavior to justify their own beliefs and practices and preferences. I'm thinking of a passage, for example, from Konrad Lorenz, the famous animal researcher, among other things, describing how, in his view, a male goose walked with stature and grandeur. It made him sound like made the male goose sound like a Prussian colonel or something. And so I think animals are sometimes a useful foil for saying, well, we're just doing dispassionate research here, but what we're doing, in fact, is projecting our own inclinations on the animal world. I mean, that may seem like a field way of setting up your article for discussion, but you know what I'm talking about, right?
Absolutely. And of course, it depends on who's doing the looking at the animal world and what they may consciously or even unconsciously be looking for. And scientific researchers have biases just like the rest of us. They try to be mindful of them. But of course, research happens, and who promotes and supports that research often, has a particular point of view. And that is the case of some research that came out in December of 2021 in the journal Behavioral Ecology. Some researchers were looking at the animal world and found some very interesting findings on intergenerational wealth among animals, which seems, that does not seem intuitive. How could animals pass on wealth? Well, it turns out that certain squirrels, for example, the red squirrel, evidently the mother squirrels sometimes will hoard nuts or pine cones or other kinds of food to be passed on to certain of their offspring, giving that offspring an advantage. So that's a case where, it sort of pays to be the privileged kid of the hoarding squirrel. And they ran through a few other examples in nature. Another interesting case was the hyena. Hyenas, as you probably know, are matriarchal, and they can pass on status to their daughters. Now, what does it mean to pass on status? It actually is the right to, for example, get the best piece of meat from a carcass, for example. So the researchers found, quite fascinating, that hyenas are able to pass on this privilege. So there are cases in which animals do this, but you could see that, to a certain mindset, that would just be candy to make the argument, oh, look, the stratified society we live in is actually natural, and it's natural for inequality to happen. We're all just greedy hoarders. We're animals, just like the red squirrel, and this is what we do. So get over it. And it turns out that the World Economic Forum seems to have been a fan of this research and was promoting it. That would be the group, of course, that puts on the Davos shindig every year, in which the rich and powerful meet to tell the rest of us how things are going to be. So, seems like there might be a little more than a coincidence there.
Yeah, it's fascinating because it suggests, first of all, the study of these animal researchers is the study of humanity, right? I mean, there are people doing this, but there are a couple of inbuilt assumptions. I was thinking while you were talking, Lynn, about Jordan Peterson, the Canadian conservative cultural theorist who loves to talk about lobsters and lobster behavior and how that should guide. Admittedly, that's an absurd. He takes it to an absurd extreme. Um, but I mean, it seems to me there are two questions in play here. One is, how do animals behave, and what does that teach us about ourselves as animals, which we are? But the other is and maybe we can take them one at a time, because the second one is, why should animal behavior guide the way we shape our society anyway? Even, and this goes back to, people, the saying that nature is red in tooth and claw and all that. But let's start with the first question. What, if anything, can we learn about ourselves by the behavior of the red squirrels?
Well, as it turns out, nature is quite diverse, and animals have a lot of different strategies for survival. So we could look to the red squirrel and see, okay, there is one strategy for survival that some squirrels perform. But on the other hand, if we looked a little closer in the animal kingdom, we would see the bonobo monkeys, and they actually are known to share food with their friends. So, some animals apparently are prone to hoarding, and others are not. I mean, that you could cherry pick other cases from nature. There are parrots that will actually share food sources with one another. And there are extreme cases. There are honeybees that will actually die to protect and defend the group. So there's a range of examples that we could take from nature, and there are plenty of cases in which sharing is the best strategy, and we can see that in human societies. There's been some fascinating anthropological work done in recent years that shows that some prehistoric or Neolithic communities evidently had a more of a sharing community and culture. For example, you can see evidence in the pre-Aztec city of Teotihuacan of sharing resources and public housing in which everybody had pretty high standards of living. You didn't just have a palace and everybody else. So, domination is not the only strategy for human leadership and human societal structure, and it's not even the only structure in animals. I think I've read about. I believe it's gorillas. It's definitely another primate in which the sort of dominant gorilla actually is more of a mediator and has more kind of social capital that he is using than was previously thought. He's not just bullying the other gorillas. He's actually a peacemaker in many cases, and that's where the power comes from. So, just cherry picking the red squirrel, I don't think really tells us a lot about how human beings do behave or should behave.
It would be interesting to see how red squirrels, how successful they are against other forms of squirrels that don't do this. I think if you really wanted to draw the conclusion that this was the best way to live, you'd have to have some sort of control study for it. But let's talk about the New York Times for a second before we go on. In your article, you quote the New York Times as saying, red squirrels are born with a silver spoon in their mouth. But cherry picking is just the word. I mean, there's so many varieties of animals out there. But this was interesting to me, Lynn Parramore. You wrote that the Times article is quick to state that the researchers, the red squirrel researchers, I guess it is, were prompted to study the topic out of concern about increasing inequality during the pandemic, and they just wanted to learn what humans could find out about the topic from nature. There has to be more to this than that, right? I mean, if I'm concerned about inequality, even if I say, well, I want to know about the biological roots of inequality, I wouldn't necessarily start with red squirrels. I'd, probably go higher level. But do you know anything about the people who did this study? Or
I don't really know. I don't really know a whole lot about what their motivation is, but I do think that they were, maybe trying to cover their butts a little bit by saying, look, we're not justifying inequality. You wouldn't want to be known as the researchers who were justifying inequality. On the other hand, I just noticed who seemed to be really liking the research and trying to promote it. And that's where, when the World Economic Forum seems to be getting behind it, it's maybe not the fault of the researchers, but you can see the way the material is sort of catnip to a certain perspective, because what you see in nature does sort of depend on your position in the human hierarchy, and those in Davos and the World Economic Forum are obviously have a certain viewpoint from the top that's not necessarily the view that the rest of us see. So it's really a question of whether we can justify inequality in human societies. And by the way, the problems that we have had with inequality are way beyond anybody passing on wealth to their offspring. I mean, we've gone way past that. And if you look at the Gilded Age, the first Gilded Age or the current Gilded Age, it's more about the concentration of wealth to such a degree that a small segment of the population is able to take over the whole political system and have armies to back its will. I don't know about you, but I never met a squirrel robber baron or a squirrel that, had political candidates in his or her pocket. So the way human society works, I mean, we've got problems that, squirrels never thought about, not to mention bonobos or hyenas or any other animals. In the animal kingdom, communities don't destroy themselves through hoarding. At least I don't know of any case where that happens. Humans are a special and rather, it's very unpleasant that we're an outlier in this way in the animal world.
I got 99 problems, but a squirrel ain't one. And we also could talk about the clownfish, because the clownfish, if I'm reading your piece correctly, was the subject of an article promoted by the World Economic Forum, the Davos crowd, because the clownfish can inherit the right to hiding places from its parents, thus enabling it to avoid predators that snack on less privileged fellows. That's of course, your description of it. Now, that seems to me more like a description of, the right to a nice house, which could exist in a social democracy as well as, or even a communist state as well as anywhere else. It doesn't seem to me the equivalent of becoming a billionaire. So how you had a link, I admit I didn't follow it. How do the billionaires and others behind the World Economic Forum present this kind of information? And I might add, how do they do it with a straight face?
Well, it's really hard to know how they do it with a straight face, because it's such an obviously self-interested argument to make. And it comes from a long, long tradition going way, way back centuries of the 1% making arguments to justify its rapacious and antisocial behavior. This is not new. This has been going on for a long time. In fact, one of the reasons that I named the article "The Fable of the Squirrels" is that there was an Anglo-Dutch political economist who came before Adam Smith, even in the 18th century, who wrote a satirical poem called "The Fable of the Bees." And he was arguing that he presented an image of a bee community that was thriving as long as all the bees were acting in their greedy self-interest. But as soon as they started behaving virtuously and treating one another with generosity and kindness, the whole bee society collapsed. Well, never mind that that's not how bees operate, but bees are actually quite cooperative animals, as we know now. He didn't probably know that then. But this argument that public vice or, private vice, greediness, for example, led to public good became a popular argument, and it's a really counterintuitive and quite ugly argument. And even Adam Smith thought that Bernard Mandeville, who wrote the poem, had gone a bit too far. And Adam Smith recognized that actually humans do have some altruistic impulses. We're not just these nasty hoarding creatures that only think about our self-interest. So the father of economics even made this point. And research, other research that we could look at suggests that humans come inborn with the quality of empathy. For example, I mentioned this in my article. researchers have found that 6-month-old babies become distressed when they see another human being bullied or treated roughly. They show signs of visible distress. So to say that we are born as these selfish creatures is really, that's contrary to what scientific research has shown. It's also contrary to our intuition if we don't happen to be maybe gathering and drinking champagne at Davos. Most of us know that there are things that motivate us way beyond self-interest and greed.
But this is such an important issue, Lynn Parramore. This is why I really appreciated your article. So Mandeville's full title of his satirical poem, Fable of the Bees, or Private Vices, Public Benefits. This whole notion of private vices, public benefits, this whole notion that people, this to me is the sort of underlying illusion of contemporary economics, that somehow people acting greedily and selfishly, all of us, will translate into better conditions for all of us, which seems to me to be not only part of, let's say, Ayn Rand's philosophy, but Milton Friedman's, basically modern economics as heterodoxy or orthodox economics. That what we're really seeing is a science, quote unquote, built to justify this belief, this fiction that even the father of modern economics thought was extreme and irrational. Am I being fair?
Yeah. I think that is very fair. We have to recall that Adam Smith, in addition to being an economist, was a moral philosopher. So he did think about ethics, and he did think about human motivation beyond greed. He wrote a book about morals and ethics before he wrote The Wealth of Nations. People sometimes forget that. But yes, that idea has been prevalent in classical economics, this homo economicus, this greedy, selfish being, act in your self-interest, and it's supposed to make everything run smoothly. And the neoliberals, sort of ran with this idea, and they sort of embraced it on steroids. The movement coming out of Vienna in the 20s that got picked up by Chicago school economists in the United States. And their philosophy really was that no government should attempt to plan anything or act in the public good. That would just make a mess of things. That competition in every area of life was the way that you got good results. I think we've had some examples in the 21st century thus far that poke some holes in that philosophy. And what we've really ended up with, in my opinion, from being steeped, I was born in 1970, and I think, the neoliberal position really started going mainstream about the time I came around and kind of went full throttle in the 80s. What we've really ended up with is not a society and economy functioning smoothly, but one that is quite unstable and filled with mentally distressed human beings who are not happy at all. We've seen during the pandemic, this has been highlighted and exacerbated, but we are more anxious and depressed and distressed possibly than we have ever been. And that is not a very strong validation for the kind of philosophy that the neoliberals have pushed upon us.
And I want to get back to that in a second, Lynn Parramore, but I want to take a digression before we do. First of all, I'm tempted to be glib and say that economics, like the red squirrel, has been hoarding nuts and keeping them for generations, passing them down from one generation to another. But of course, I don't want to be that unkind. But there's a passage about Mandeville here. Again, Mandeville being the 18th century philosopher and political economist who kind of talked about private vices turning into public benefits by misdescribing the life of the bee. Now, this is just a passing really comment in your piece, but to me undergirds a lot of the conflicts we're seeing now, the ideological conflicts. It says, you write, rather, he, Mandeville, found himself in agreement with Rene Descartes' spectacularly wrong view that animals were little more than physical machines. A cuckoo bird and a cuckoo clock were much the same, only one you don't have to feed. They're mindless automata. That has been a remarkably durable and, to me, almost sociopathic way of viewing the natural world, that animals are not alive, that you can do with them what you want, you can torment them as you want, you can experiment on them, you can raise them in, all down the line, because they're not real, they're just mechanical. And by extension, since so many animals in this question are mammals, then I think that bleeds over to a lack of compassion towards fellow human beings, which to me undergirds a lot of this thinking about, quote unquote, the human animal. That, well, red squirrels, some live, some die if they don't have the mother who ordered or whatever. Clownfish, they don't get the good property, they get eaten. Well, that's the way it goes. And that they're just machines anyway, automata. And that, to a certain extent, in this, what I would call economic ideology, that's the way people are treated too. Well, some people live, some people die, some people get healthcare, some don't, some get killed in wars, whatever. Do you get what I'm driving at?
Absolutely. Some of the great philosophical thinkers on animal rights, such as Tom Reagan, Peter Singer, and others, have discussed this. You can tell a lot about a society by the way animals are treated. You could look at any factory farm and come out of it with a sense of horror. And the only way you can justify that grotesque treatment of animals is to pretend that they don't feel pain and that they're just these mindless automata. So that idea has stuck around. And if you look at the people who work in these factory farms, I think you would very easily see conditions of inhumanity in the treatment of the workers, long hours, unsafe conditions, unsanitary conditions. So I think it absolutely does translate. And we've structured a society in which people are expendable. I mean, people are almost externalities to the economy, except that, segment at the top that's reaping the benefits. And the pandemic, again, has really highlighted this. You and I have talked about this. There have been politicians, Republican politicians, who've come flat out and said that certain people need to sacrifice themselves for this economy. They needed to go back to work, even when there weren't sufficient protections, even before we had vaccines available. Hop to it. The economy demands this sacrifice of you, not of me, of course, not me, the politician that's speaking. But I think it absolutely does bleed over. Our view and our treatment of animals absolutely does bleed over into how we view our fellow human beings. I think that's absolutely true.
And, I don't understand. Now science is beginning to affirm what most of us have sensed by looking into the eyes of an animal or touching, petting an animal, whatever, which is that, of course, they have feelings, they have sensations, very much, brain imagery, very much the way we do. So, but that should have been obvious. To me, this is a 3-century or so long journey into, I'll use the word again, a kind of sociopathy that, frankly, even though I'm not a big fan of the Davos crowd, I'm pretty disturbed that they're pushing this kind of information. It suggests that the crisis in compassion that we face as a species might be even worse than I realized.
I think that's a really good phrase, crisis of compassion. And when we lack compassion and empathy, we're denying our human birthright, as we were just discussing. People are born with the capacity to feel empathy at 6 months of age. This is part of what makes us human. And to cut ourselves off from that instinct is to make us into something less than fully human and mentally ill. I mean, the lack of empathy that is emphasized in our community. You know, kids are taught to compete with each other from the very get-go, not to share information and share knowledge. Even a child, even trying to do something, express itself like jumping or running, is going to be very quickly funneled into a competitive sport where the task is to beat the person next to you and win the prize. You know, we teach this to children very early. It's like we're training them out of their natural instinct to work with each other and to protect each other and to help each other. And I think there's plenty of evidence, again, that human societies that are stable and that create healthy inhabitants certainly emphasize empathy and a sharing of resources. You know, we're not lone wolves. Even the lone wolf is a myth that really doesn't exist. Wolves hunt together, so even that is sort of a fable. But we don't survive just as competitive individuals. And we're sort of proving that right now. I mean, again, no animal hoards to the point that the whole community is destroyed. And we're getting to the point we may destroy our entire environment because of our hoarding and our greed and our inability to have empathy for our fellow humans or creatures. So it's a very anti-life, anti-instinctual, as you say, sociopathic perspective that I think a lot of us are trying to desperately shake ourselves out of. But it's very deeply ingrained. You know, this way of thinking really, you know, as I said, kind of went on steroids in the 1980s. And a lot of kids who grew up after that really haven't seen any other way of being. You know, my mother, for example, saw communities coming together during the Great Depression and after World War II. But kids, you know, who came about after the 1980s have seen very little of what it means to have social cooperation on a large scale. And so they're going to have to rediscover our humanity, really.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And toward that point, Lynn Parramore, you write the following. Even if you pick out 100 cases of animals hoarding resources, to privilege themselves and their offspring, you have to be mindful of extrapolating to human society. And you write, that's because alone among animals, we actually have choices about how we organize ourselves. We get to decide what way of living suits us best. And it seems to me that this research and the weaponization of this research, kind of research by groups like the World Economic Forum, seems to me it's about, among other things, disempowering us, getting us to believe that we don't have choices about how to organize ourselves. We don't get to decide the way of living that suits us best because we're just red squirrels with opposable thumbs. We're just built to function this way, and we have no say in it. It's just our natural state. So just give in and surrender to the 0.01%. Agree with that?
Yeah, I think that's true. And again, there's interesting anthropological and historical research done in the last decade or so. For example, the anthropologist David Graeber, in his last book that he wrote before he passed away, an untimely death, was discussing how during the Enlightenment, for example, Native Americans who were brought to Europe, there were some Native American elders and intellectuals who were brought to Europe to observe European society, and they criticized what they were seeing, and they couldn't believe the inequality, and they couldn't believe the poverty and people in rags on the street, because that's not how they organized themselves. They had, I mean, it's, you know, Native American tribes had a diversity in the way that they organized themselves, but many of them had a much more egalitarian structure. So they found it really horrifying to observe the way Europeans were doing things. It didn't look advanced to them at all. It looked very dreadful and unhappy. So it's just to make the point. human beings have had a variety of ways that they've organized themselves, some for better and for worse. And the way we have been organizing ourselves under this neoliberal philosophy, I think is, if somebody from outer space could look and an alien examine our entire culture from beginning to end, would say this is not really a high point of human prosperity
No.
and happiness.
Well, also, it does not argue that this species is capable of learning from experience, because we've tried this kind of inequality before, and it was unstable and it failed, and yet we're doing it again. And this time, with, as you mentioned, the fate of the planet at stake. So, a fascinating topic and a very important one. Any closing thoughts before I let you go, Lynn?
I think my closing thought would be to just emphasize something you said. We are human and we do have choices in how we organize ourselves. So never believe anybody from the World Economic Forum or elsewhere that tells you that we all just have to suck it up. This is the way it is. This is not the way it is. And even in recent history, after World War II, we had a much more egalitarian economy. This is not the way it has always been. And it's not the way it has been even in fairly recent history. I think we're in the midst of something that is more of an aberration in terms of thinking about how we should organize ourselves. We are not greedy, selfish hoarders who only seek to compete with each other. We're much more than that. I think I quoted Shakespeare in my piece. We are infinite in faculty. We are much better than neoliberals and classical economists gave us credit for being in most cases.
Yep. And we're capable of having conversations like this, which proves that we're capable of doing better than some fictional programming. So unfortunately, on that note, we'll have to end. But Lynn Parramore is an author and cultural historian. The article, if you'd like to read it, and I think you'd enjoy it, is in ineteconomics.org. Fable of the Squirrels, new research on wealth inequality among animals, sparks debate on human economies. Lynn, thanks for writing it. And as always, thanks for coming on the program.
And thank you for providing this space for us to have a conversation like this. Thank you.
Our pleasure. And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The 0 Hour.